My phone buzzed with another vendor confirmation as I reviewed the final invoice details for tonight's event. Moonrise Manor had outdone themselves with the floral arrangements, exactly as I'd specified when I signed the contract 6 months ago. The crystal chandeliers cast perfect light across the reception hall, illuminating 300 guests who had no idea they were celebrating in a venue I owned through my hospitality investment portfolio. I'm Catherine Morrison, though most people here still think of me as little Katie, who used to follow her older siblings around. At 31, I spent the last 12 years building Morrison Hospitality Group from a single restaurant investment into a network of premium venues across 3 states. But tonight, I wasn't here as a CEO. I was here as family, watching my cousin Derek marry his college sweetheart in what everyone assumed was just another expensive wedding venue. The irony wasn't lost on me. When Derek had called 8 months ago, panicked because his original venue had double booked, I'd quietly arranged for Moonrise Manor to have a last-minute cancellation. The booking fee alone could have covered a luxury car, but family was family. Even family that had spent years treating me like I was still the awkward teenager who chose business school over sorority life. Julia approached my table near the back, her champagne flute already half empty despite the reception starting only an hour ago. At 35, she perfected the art of looking elegant while radiating disapproval. Tonight's target seemed to be my choice to sit quietly, rather than mingle with her circle of pharmaceutical sales executives. "Katie," she said, settling into the chair beside me without invitation. "You look nice." The pause said everything. My simple black cocktail dress, understated jewelry, and practical heels clearly didn't meet her standards for a family celebration. Julia had always believed that success was measured by how much you spent on looking successful, a philosophy that worked well for someone married to a surgeon, but less well for building actual wealth. "Thank you," I replied, checking my phone as another message came in from my property manager. 3 more venue bookings for next month, including 2 corporate events that would bring in serious revenue. The ceremony was beautiful. Derek looked happy. "Yes, well, happiness doesn't pay the bills," Julia said, swirling her champagne. "Speaking of which, I heard you finally moved out of that apartment complex downtown. Aunt Margaret said you bought something in the suburbs." I smiled slightly. The something in the suburbs was a custom-built home on 15 acres. But I'd learned long ago that explaining my actual financial situation to Julia only led to accusations of showing off or lying. Better to let family assume what they wanted to assume. "Something like that," I said. The band finished their current song, and Derek's new father-in-law approached the microphone to give a toast. Robert Chen had made his fortune in tech startups, and his speech was polished, warm, and mercifully brief. As applause filled the room, I noticed Julia checking her phone, probably coordinating with our mother about something. Mom had been unusually quiet tonight, which typically meant she was planning something. At 62, Patricia Morrison still treated family gatherings like military campaigns, complete with strategic seating arrangements and carefully timed conversations designed to achieve maximum emotional impact. Tonight's campaign seemed focused on what she called Katie's situation. My situation in their minds was that I was 31, unmarried, and working in restaurants. They knew I'd started with a small investment in a local bistro, but the details of how that had grown into a multi-million-dollar hospitality empire remained conveniently overlooked. When you don't fit into family expectations, people tend to see only what confirms their existing beliefs. "Katie." My brother Michael appeared at our table. looking uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo. At 28, he'd followed the approved family path. Law school, corporate job, marriage to another lawyer, house in the right neighborhood. Mom wants to talk to you after the cake cutting. Julia's eyes lit up with anticipation. Whatever Mom had planned, my siblings were clearly in on it. I'd seen this dynamic before, usually at holidays when someone had decided it was time for another intervention about my life choices. Of course, I said calmly, looking forward to it. Michael hesitated, probably expecting more resistance. It's just that we're all worried about you. Working such long hours, not dating anyone seriously, living alone in that big house. So they did know about the house. Interesting. Someone had been doing research, which meant tonight's conversation would be more serious than usual. I wondered if they'd figured out who actually owned it, or if they just assumed I was renting something beyond my apparent means. The cake cutting proceeded with appropriate fanfare, followed by more dancing and the gradual migration of older guests toward the exit. By 10 o'clock, only about half the original crowd remained, mostly Derek's college friends and our extended family. Julia had switched from champagne to wine, which usually meant her filter was about to disappear entirely. I was reviewing emails when the music suddenly stopped. Julia stood near the band's setup, holding the wireless microphone with the confidence of someone who'd consumed just enough alcohol to believe everyone wanted to hear her thoughts. "Excuse me, everyone," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the reception hall. "I know this is Derek and Amanda's special day, but I think it's important that we talk about what family really means." A murmur of confusion rippled through the remaining guests. Derek looked mortified. Amanda's parents exchanged concerned glances. This wasn't part of the planned program. "Family means supporting each other," Julia continued, swaying slightly. "Family means being honest about our shortcomings. And sometimes, family means acknowledging that some people here don't deserve to celebrate with real family." She was looking directly at me. Some people who've forgotten where they come from, who think they're better than everyone else because they bought a big house they can't actually afford, who sit in the back row like they don't belong here. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Conversations died. Even the catering staff stopped moving. 200 people were now staring at me, waiting to see how I'd respond to being publicly humiliated at my cousin's wedding. I stood slowly, smoothing my dress, and walked calmly toward the back of the room. Not toward Julia, not toward the microphone, but toward the service area where I could make a phone call in relative privacy. My hands remained steady as I scrolled through my contacts, finding the number I needed. "Robert," I said when he answered on the second ring. "Sorry to bother you so late, but could you come to Moonrise Manor? There's a situation with one of the guests that requires the owner's attention." "On my way, boss," Robert Martinez replied. He'd been managing Moonrise Manor for 3 years, ever since I'd acquired the property and renovated it into the area's premier wedding venue. "Everything okay? Just need you to clarify some things for the guests. 5 minutes?" 3 minutes. I was in the office reviewing tomorrow's setup. I ended the call and returned to my table, where Julia was now explaining to the crowd how disappointed our parents were in my life choices, how I'd wasted my education, how I was embarrassing the family name, how my selfish decisions affected everyone who cared about me. Mom had joined her near the microphone, nodding along with appropriate maternal concern. Michael stood nearby, ready to provide backup support. Even some of our cousins were nodding, probably thinking about their own successful careers and stable relationships. 3 minutes later, Robert entered through the main doors. his suit impeccable despite the late hour. He surveyed the scene quickly, taking in Julia's impromptu speech and the awkward audience, then walked directly to me. "Ms. Morrison," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent room. "I got here as quickly as I could. How can I help?" The effect was immediate and total. Every conversation stopped. Julia's voice trailed off mid-sentence. The microphone slipped slightly in her hand as she processed what she just heard. "Thank you for coming, Robert," I said, standing to greet him. "I was hoping you could clarify something for our guests about the venue policies." "Of course, boss. What do you need?" That second "boss" hit the room like a physical force. Julia's face went from flushed to pale in approximately 3 seconds. Mom's expression shifted from concern to confused to something approaching horror as the implications became clear. "Actually," I said, looking around at my family's stunned faces, "I think the clarification can wait. Why don't you go ahead and prepare tomorrow's SAP? I'll handle things here." Robert nodded professionally. "Let me know if you need anything else. The night security team is already in place, and I'll be in the office until midnight finishing the quarterly reports." As he left, the silence in the room became deafening. Julia still held the microphone, but no words were coming out. Derek and Amanda stood frozen by their cake table, probably wondering if their wedding reception had just turned into a family catastrophe. I walked slowly back toward the front of the room, my heels clicking against the marble floor that I'd personally selected during the renovation. Past the crystal chandeliers I'd chosen, past the custom millwork I'd commissioned, past family members who were beginning to understand that the little sister they'd been pitying owned the ground they were standing on. "Julia," I said gently, extending my hand, "can I have the microphone back?" She handed it over wordlessly, her eyes wide with something between shock and mortification. I looked out at the crowd, taking in the faces of relatives who'd spent years assuming I was struggling, friends who'd heard Julia's speech, and were now recalculating everything they thought they knew about family dynamics. "I want to thank everyone for celebrating Derek and Amanda's wedding with us tonight," I began, my voice calm and warm. Moonrise Manor has hosted hundreds of celebrations over the past 3 years, but tonight was especially meaningful because it was family. I paused, letting that sink in. Family gatherings are interesting things. They remind us where we came from, who shaped us, and sometimes they show us how far we've traveled from those beginnings. Tonight, my sister shared some concerns about my life choices, and I appreciate her honesty. Julia was now staring at her feet, probably calculating how much damage control would be needed. She's right that I did buy a house I can't afford. The mortgage payment is 0 because I paid cash. She's also right that I work long hours in restaurants. When you own 15 of them across 3 states, the hours can be challenging. The murmur that went through the crowd was audible now. Math was being recalculated. Assumptions were crumbling. But most importantly, she's right about family. Family does mean supporting each other, being honest about our shortcomings, and acknowledging when we've made mistakes. I looked directly at Julia, who was now visibly shaking. The mistake here isn't that someone doesn't deserve to celebrate with family. The mistake is that family members can spend years making assumptions about each other without ever asking the right questions. I handed the microphone back to the band leader and returned to my table. Around me, conversation slowly resumed, but the energy had completely shifted. Small groups formed as people processed what had just happened. Derek approached with Amanda, both looking concerned. "Katie," Derek said quietly, "I had no idea." "About the venue," About your business. I'm so sorry about Julia. Don't apologize for your wedding, I smiled. This is your day. Julia and I can work things out later. Amanda squeezed my hand. For what it's worth, the venue is absolutely perfect. Robert and his team have been incredible to work with. After they left, I noticed Mom approaching slowly, her face showing the kind of careful calculation that meant she was trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. Michael followed a few steps behind, clearly uncomfortable. Katie, Mom said, settling into the chair beside me. We need to talk. I know. 15 restaurants. Really? 17, actually. I just closed on 2 more properties last week. She absorbed this information, probably running through years of family conversations where she'd expressed concern about my career prospects. Why didn't you tell us? I considered several responses, all of them true, because you never asked, because you'd already decided what my life looked like, because every time I tried to share good news, someone changed the subject to when I was getting married, because I learned early that success makes some people uncomfortable. I said instead, it was easier to let you assume what you wanted to assume. Michael finally joined us, looking like he wanted to disappear entirely. I called the office this week, he said quietly, to check on some real estate investments. Morrison Hospitality Group came up in the search. I know. My assistant mentioned that someone with our last name had been asking questions. Your assistant said you were in Europe, finalizing acquisition deals. London and Paris, 2 boutique hotels that came on the market. I got back yesterday. The weight of their assumptions was becoming clear. While they'd been worrying about my financial stability, I'd been building an international portfolio. While they'd been planning interventions about my life choices, I'd been making decisions that affected hundreds of employees across multiple countries. Katie, Mom said carefully, I think we owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything, but you might want to think about how you talk to people before understanding their situations. Julia appeared at our table, having apparently worked up the courage to face the aftermath of her speech. Her earlier confidence had been replaced by something approaching devastation. Katie, I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything tonight. This is Derek's wedding. Let's focus on that. But I humiliated you in front of everyone. You humiliated yourself, Julia. I'm fine. She sat down heavily, probably realizing that her public critique of my life had backfired spectacularly. The sister she'd been pitying was now revealed as the most successful person in the room, and everyone had witnessed the reversal. How long have you owned this place? 3 years. I bought it when the previous owners were struggling with debt. Robert's been managing it since then. And you arranged for Derek to book it? I may have influenced the availability. The reception was winding down now, with most guests having departed during the family drama. Derek and Amanda were saying goodbye to the remaining relatives, probably eager to escape to their honeymoon and leave the Morrison family dysfunction behind. As the evening ended, I found myself standing alone in the empty reception hall, watching the catering staff clean up under Robert's supervision. The crystal chandeliers still cast perfect light, the flowers still looked stunning, and the marble floor still gleamed. But the atmosphere had completely changed. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Thank you for everything. Tonight, the venue, and for handling Julia with more class than she deserved. Another message came in from my attorney, confirming that tomorrow's hotel acquisition in Chicago had been approved. $25 million for a boutique property that would anchor our Midwest expansion. The kind of deal that happened while family members were assuming I was struggling to pay rent. Robert approached as the last of the catering equipment was loaded onto trucks. Everything secure for the night, boss. Tomorrow's wedding setup starts at 8. Thanks, Robert. Any issues with tonight's guests? He smiled diplomatically. Nothing we haven't handled before. Family dynamics can be complicated. That's one way to put it. As I drove home through the quiet streets, I thought about Julia's words. Some people don't deserve to celebrate with real family. She'd been right, in a way. Some people don't deserve certain things, but not because of their financial status or life choices, because of how they treat others when they think they have power over them. The next morning brought a stack of messages from various family members. Apologies, explanations, requests for coffee meetings to clear the air. Julia had apparently spent the night calling relatives to explain her side of the story, which only made things worse as people realized how badly she'd misjudged the situation. Mom's message was the most direct. Can we please have lunch this week? I think we have a lot to discuss. I replied to her and ignored the others. Some conversations were worth having. Others were just damage control. 3 weeks later, I sat in Mom's kitchen drinking coffee and reviewing the final contracts for our Seattle expansion. She'd spent the time since the wedding asking careful questions about my business, clearly trying to understand how the daughter she'd been worried about had become more successful than anyone in the family. I keep thinking about that night, she said, refilling my cup. How wrong we were about everything. You weren't wrong about everything, just about some important things. Julia's been struggling since then. The pharmaceutical company laid off half their sales team last month. I'd heard. Julia's husband was also facing potential malpractice issues related to a patient care incident. The perfect life she'd been projecting was apparently less perfect than anyone realized. I'm sorry to hear that. She wants to apologize properly, face to face. She can call me when she's ready. 6 months after Derek's wedding, Julia finally made that call. We met at one of my restaurants, a farm-to-table place in the arts district that had become popular with young professionals. She looked older, less polished, more genuine than I'd seen her in years. I spent months being angry, she said over our appetizers. Angry that you'd let us all look like fools. Angry that you hadn't told us the truth about your success. And now I realize I was angry at myself for being the kind of person who would attack family in public, for making assumptions about your life without ever asking about it. We talked for 2 hours, covering years of family dynamics, missed connections, and mutual misunderstandings. For the first time since we were children, Julia seemed interested in my actual life rather than her version of it. Can I ask you something? She said as we finished dessert. Of course. When you were building all this, the restaurants, the venues, the success, did you ever think about proving us wrong? I considered the question carefully. Honestly, no. I was too busy building something to spend much time thinking about what other people thought of it. Even when we were dismissive, even when we acted like you were failing, especially then, other people's opinions don't pay employees or satisfy customers. As we left the restaurant, Julia paused at the entrance. Derek and Amanda's first anniversary is coming up. They're planning a small celebration. That's nice. At Moonrise Manor, I think they like having family events where they know the owner will take good care of them. I smiled. Robert runs a good operation. Would you consider letting me help with the planning? I promised not to grab any microphones. Talk to Robert. If he needs extra help coordinating, I'm sure he'd appreciate it. A year later, Julia had become our unofficial family event coordinator, working closely with Robert to manage Morrison family celebrations. She discovered she had genuine talent for hospitality planning, and I discovered that my sister was actually likable when she wasn't busy judging everyone around her. The family dynamic had shifted permanently. People asked about my business now, showed genuine interest in my projects, treated me like the successful adult I'd become rather than the struggling younger sister they'd assumed I was. Even Derek had started consulting with me about his own investment decisions. But the most important change was simpler than any of that. When I walked into family gatherings now, I wasn't the person who didn't deserve to be there. I was the person who made sure everyone else had a place to belong. Success isn't just about building wealth or acquiring properties. It's about building the kind of life where you can be generous with others, even when they haven't been generous with you. It's about having the confidence to remain calm when people attack you publicly, because you know who you are and what you've accomplished. And sometimes, it's about owning the venue where your family finally learns to see you clearly.